I'd be happy to. Vice Chair, Madam Chair, members of the commission, I will now call roll. Greg Heyman,
Present.
Emily Simnett, Richard Devlin,
Present.
Sandy Rowe,
Present.
Rukaya Adams. That is roll, and that is a quorum, Chair. And I will note that it appears Commissioner Simnett has just joined. So I'll include her in the roll, as well as noting that Commissioner Yamasaki is joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Guthrie. Appreciate that. I don't have many opening remarks. I think I do want to not pretend that we're not aware of what's going on around education. And while I don't want to dive into that, I do want to say that this certainly makes our work all the more important. There are certainly plenty of challenges in education, and perhaps even more so at the moment. And we need to be mindful of that as we face the work that we do. I think I've been thinking about how if we really follow through on it, and I don't like the word if, but our recently adopted strategic plan really positions us well, I think, to respond and continue to work towards, I think, a healthy higher education system in Oregon. So all I come away from that is going, I always knew our work was important, but perhaps I know that more so at the moment. And so just thank you for being a part of this. I just want to review the agenda. We have a number of action items. I want to remind you that our action items 3 and action item 5 are recommendations, forwarded them to the full commission tomorrow with a recommendation to approve or not. So that's just a reminder that that's our work is to sort of dive into the detail of the things and that have to do with finance and that its relationship to achievement issues, and then forward that recommendation to the full commission for their action tomorrow. So with that, I would ask for a review and a approval of the meeting minutes from December, if you can remember back that far.
Move for approval.
Second.
Well, thank you. Thank you. All in favor of that? You can raise your hands.
Mr. Chair, I should abstain.
So, we did check on that issue, and actually, even though you weren't there, you have a full right to vote on the minutes for that meeting, but it's fine to abstain. So,
Okay.
just legal technicality there. So,
Well, I'll be inconsistent then, and tomorrow for the full meeting,
Thank you so much, Commissioner Devlin. With that, we have approved the minutes from December. We'll move on to public comment. Guthrie, do we have people signed up for public comment?
None signed up for the subcommittee, Chair, and noting none in the chat.
Okay. Then we shall move forward to our first action item, which is capital construction report. I believe Jim Pickard is going to be making that report, and thank you for joining us, Jim.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you on this beautiful sunny afternoon before the weather turns tomorrow, as I understand. For the record, Jim Pinkard, I'm with the Office of Post-Secondary Finance and Capital here at the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. And this item, as the chair mentioned, is an action item for your consideration. It is a report on capital construction projects required by statute. And on page 3 in table A, I think is a great summary of what's in the report. Essentially, we're asked to report to the legislature a summary of all the previously approved capital construction projects that have been financed with state-backed bonds or other state or federal public funding at Oregon's public universities and community colleges. So essentially in the last 2 years, what projects have been completed, what projects are ongoing, and what's the status of all those projects. And so as you can see on page 3 in table A, in the last 2 years, we've completed about 20 projects, for which by completed, by the way, I mean we as HECC staff have completed the reimbursement to the institution. Construction has typically finished at that point as well, although typically construction ends even before we're done fully reimbursing for the project costs. But nonetheless, 20 projects have been completed for a total of $256 million roughly. And right now, as of the 1st of December, so this data is a little old at this point, but we had 47 active projects totaling $560 million. To give you an idea of what that looks like day to day, last year in calendar year 2024, we on average receive about 18 requests for reimbursement every month. We send out about $19 million in reimbursements every month. So total last calendar year, we reimbursed $223.8 million across 220 separate requests, about $1 million per request. And those are, again, to the 24 institutions, the universities and the community colleges. OHSU is separate. They go through DAS directly. So as you go through the report, you'll just see more information on each and every project, the draw total, the current balance, the date we expect either A, construction to be completed, or B, when we expect to reimburse and be complete. And then there are project descriptions in the back of the report as well. And with that, I'll pause for questions. This is for your action today. The action that we recommend you take is to adopt this report and forward it to the full commission tomorrow for consideration. It is an action item on tomorrow's agenda, although the exact item number slips my mind. It's probably 11 or 12 on the agenda for tomorrow.
Anyone have questions?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Commissioner Devlin.
Thank you. Jim, you actually in your presentation already answered one of my questions, so I only have one left. On the left-hand side, project title, I noticed that some of them have a year in them, which I would assume is the year it was authorized, but not all of them. And is it possible in future reports to have that date? Because, I mean, there can obviously be a lot of reasons why a project has not proceeded. But sometimes when you see a date that says 2019, it's 2025 now, although we think that particular one is going to be completed. It would be good to have those dates when they were authorized. And I'm sure you might be knowledgeable in terms of, we don't have to go into that now, about issues that are facing some of the projects, either, like we have had a couple of universities come back and ask for additional funds because their original estimates were inaccurate. And sometimes also it can be difficulties in certain areas just getting contractors during certain times of the year. So I was just wondering if in the future, if we could have the date that project is authorized on each one of these.
Yeah, we certainly can, Commissioner, and I appreciate the question. So you will note in the project title, to your point, you're exactly right. Most of them do have a date in the project title. That is the biennium in which they were authorized. But for those that don't, I'm looking on page 5. Maybe that's a bad page. Page 6 in table B. Those that don't have a date in the project title, those are not bond funded. Those are funded with either lottery funds, federal funds, or regular general fund. So for example, the Lynn Benton to Kenna Hall elevator replacement was a general fund project, but we can certainly include in future reports the biennium in which they were appropriated.
And by general fund project, you mean it was a project that was funded directly without bonding. So it's a smaller project, so they just decided to appropriate whatever, $3 million, $4 million, $5 million.
Correct, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Jim? I had one, but Commissioner Devlin just asked it, so I don't have to ask it. So thank you. I've been preempted. Okay, if there are no more questions or comments, ask for a motion. The motion will be to forward it to the full commission with a recommendation to approve.
So recommend, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Simnett. All in favor? Just some signal. Thank you. We have approved it. Okay, the next item is a presentation. Jim, I believe you have this. Is on the public university tuition setting and affordability issue.
I do, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. And I'm sharing my screen, Guthrie. I hope that's okay. This is docket item 4.0A in specific. And so hopefully you can see the screen that I'm sharing now.
We can see it.
We do.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much. I wanted to walk you through just a general conversation related to the public university tuition setting process, but I really wanted to focus the conversation around the connection between tuition, or the more broadly, the costs students pay, and tie that back to student affordability and the trend that we've seen in student affordability. So we do have some annual requirements. We can talk about the HECC role and describe the principles that guide staff analysis of these increases. But I really want to focus on the connection to affordability. You'll see on the right-hand side of this chart, this is one of the 4 charges for this subcommittee. The annual requirements laid out in statute that every year all 7 of the public universities have to abide by in their tuition setting process includes, creating a tuition advisory body with a minimum of 8 members, 4 of which have to be students. There's also mandatory participation by administrators and faculty. The university administration has to provide training to those 8 members on, the budget process, the legislative process, revenues, and other issues. They have to provide meaningful opportunities for engagement, specifically with a focus on the student government to participate. They have to provide a written report and offer the opportunity for the inclusion of dissenting opinions as appropriate. And then they must post all the documentation on websites, and they have to document their recommendations, including the potential impact. The HECC's role is very limited, admittedly. The HECC is in statute obligated to review proposed annual tuition and fee increases that exceed 5% for resident undergraduate students only. And so this chart just lays out the percent of students that we're talking about. So in terms of headcount, when you look at the number of students via headcount, resident undergraduate students comprise about 43% of the students at the 7 universities, and they pay about 27% of all the tuition revenue. This is from fiscal year 2024. So we're talking to 43% of the students who pay in about 27% of tuition revenue. I will note that fee revenue adds another $56 million in total across all students during fiscal year 2024. But that gives you an idea of how many students we're talking about and what percentage of the total tuition revenue collections we're talking about. When we say tuition revenue, I should note that that is net tuition. The current status, so what we do as HECC staff is we monitor the various stages of the tuition setting process at all 7 universities through their required websites. Sometimes we attend their board meetings just to observe the process. Sometimes we'll drop in on town halls. But this table just gives you an idea of where each and every one of the 7 universities is at in terms of the town halls that they're going to hold, when their recommendations are going to be presented from the tuition setting body to their president, and then when it'll go to their governing board committee, and then when we expect the full board to take action, mostly in April. Some of them, though, are as soon as March, in a couple of weeks. Eastern is always in May, late April, early May. Should it be necessary for HECC staff to consider an increase that exceeds 5%, this is what the review timeline would look like. The board, governing board, would take action first. So they would have to adopt the increase of greater than 5%. And then in administrative rule, we lay out a process by which we give them 7 days to notify us here at the HECC and provide information that's required in statute. And then we give interested parties, all interested parties, another week to provide information to us in support of our review work. And so we lay out essentially 2 weeks, 14 days, but we're always interested in hearing from interested parties, whether they be faculty, staff, and students on campus, or whether they be community-based organizations or other interested parties, to help us assess and complete our review. And then, of course, we as HECC staff would bring this information to a full meeting of the HECC for the commissioners to consider the request during a public meeting. And again, the consideration of the request has to occur, well, generally has to occur at a public meeting of the full commission, where interested parties will be given a chance to be heard. And then as HECC staff, we'll make specific recommendations, which we will post online with the meeting materials. The last time we went through all this was in 2019. So it's been a few years, but we've tried in the interim to really structure this process and include specific touch points where interested parties can be heard through public comment, and then we as HECC staff will make specific recommendations. When we assess any increases of greater than 5%, here are the principles that we use to guide that review. 3 in particular: fostering an inclusive process, safeguarding access and support, specifically for degree completion by underrepresented students, and then do the financial conditions exist that demonstrate the need for an increase that's greater than 5%? I'll go out on a limb and tell you that these are actually ordered by difficulty, really, because by fostering an inclusive and transparent process, we can measure that fairly easily. We can talk to student governments at the institutions and assess whether they've been afforded meaningful opportunities to engage. Safeguarding access, we can assess through the impact of any proposed increase on remission programs, and we can use analytical tools to assess some of that information. The financial conditions, that's usually where we spend a lot of time trying to really get a good handle on, are the current and projected financial conditions that they're expecting do they necessitate an increase, and what does that look like? So we often ask about cost containment efforts within the board's control and other factors. So that's a very abbreviated sense of how we as HECC staff conduct that analysis. But I really want to focus on the remaining 2 slides in this deck. And this slide admittedly is a little busy. It's a lot of information, but I want to tie this back to student costs over time. And this is information that focuses on first-time, full-time resident undergraduate students, and it is unadjusted for inflation. And you can see 3 different measures. At the very top in the dark dotted line, that is the total cost of attendance. The line in the middle, in the red, the solid line, is the average net price. And then the line at the bottom in the green, the dash dot line, is just tuition and fees. Sorry, do we have a question? Okay.
Not at this point.
Okay, so what I wanted to tease out on this chart is really what's noted on the right-hand slide, part of the slide, which is that in the last decade, we have seen the sticker price, tuition and fees, by itself increase on average across all 7 universities by 4.2%. And there is a separate docket item posted with the materials for today, 4.0B. It's called supporting data, that gives you all the numbers for all of the 7 universities for each one of these components over time. The data is pulled from iPads, and I want to spend just a second talking about that because there's also information very similar to this included in the public university data dashboards published on our website. That is put together by our research and data office. It's wonderful information. If you haven't had a chance to look at that data, I'd encourage you to. This data we got from iPads, though, simply because this focuses more narrowly on first-time, full-time resident undergraduates. So think about your entering freshman students, right? So it really tries to tease out data for them in particular. But you'll see that the sticker price for tuition and fees has grown 4.2%, which is higher than inflation. But then when you look at the total cost of attendance, and total cost of attendance includes room and board, transportation expenses, personal expenses, as well as tuition and fees. So the total cost of attendance is a much broader indication of what it actually costs in total to attend. And tuition and fees is only about half that. So some of that cost, housing, for example, transportation expenses and others, are completely outside of the governing board's control. But we've seen that on average every year increase a little less than inflation, about 2.8%. But the average net price, again, on this chart in red, what students actually pay, which is less than the full cost of attendance, that's grown on average about 2.5% per year. So it's grown less than inflation. The average net price, what students actually pay, has grown a little bit less than inflation over the last decade. And that's largely because of what we see on this next slide, which is affordability. This is a look at the affordability measure over time. And of course, you can get a lot more data, underlying data by demographic, including race, ethnicity, Pell Recipient status, geographic origin, gender. You can get a lot more underlying data and detail around this metric from the Public University Data Dashboard. But over time, in the past decade, we've seen the percent of students for whom costs outweigh available resources decline from 64% to 50%, which is a trend heading in the right direction. Obviously, 50% means half of students can't afford the total cost of attendance with available resources. So not where we'd prefer to be, of course, but we have made progress. And we've made progress because of additional funding in state financial aid programs, and also the institutions through remissions have almost doubled just in the last 5 years the amount that they contribute for institutional financial aid, from roughly $1,400 to $2,500 per student on average. So via additional state financial aid and via additional institutional financial aid, we're seeing a decrease in the percent of students who can't afford college. And I'll quickly note that in the last decade, every year on average for the Public University Support Fund, we've seen a growth in state funding of about 10%, for OOG about 14%. So the state legislature, to their great credit, in the last decade has really tried to help us, kind of catch up after the Great Recession, when funding had to be cut so much. But so I think we've made some progress, but not nearly the amount of progress I think we would all hope to see. But that's my attempt to try to connect this more tangibly to affordability in a very specific way. So I'll pause there for any questions that may have come up during the conversation.
Commissioner Devlin, you have a question?
Yes. statement and a question. I can see what the numbers are trying to depict here. This is on your first slide. But my underlying concern is that averages can sometimes be deceptive because they're literally taking a large group and saying that this applies to all of them. So let me give you an example. If you are eligible for an opportunity grant and you're eligible for a Pell Grant, you may be on that side that says the actual cost is reduced. But if you're not eligible for a Pell Grant, you're not eligible for an opportunity grant, for one reason or another, you're not eligible for one of the remission programs that a university has, you could be facing the full cost increase that's there. It would be interesting to get more detail on this, and maybe some of that by probably only though in raw numbers if we went to the source, but to see how different groups are impacted within this. I mean, I spent some time last night looking at a couple universities and their remissions program, and I can tell you quite honestly, there's not a lot of data and not a lot of information online. So it's really hard sometimes to figure out where the remissions are going and who they're going to, although in some cases it's pretty clear. The other thing is, I think we should think about remissions in a different way. I think they're positive in general, but realize that remissions means that the university is reducing the cost for some students, but the underlying cost still exists there. So they have to move that reduction in revenue to some other area. And they only have limited areas, other students, and obviously better levels of support from the state. So remissions are not just free money. I mean, going from the institutions. And going to the second slide, one of the things I think here that's important is we both know from previous presentations, we all know that this one about affordability, first of all, is based only on students, not on people that perhaps wanted to attend their freshman year and chose not to because they basically could not afford it. So it's people who are already attending. We also know from previous presentations that the affordability factor here, the number unaffordable is higher for university students than community college students. So this is actually merging the two. And quite honestly, even if we were down to 50% for both, which we're not, this is an average between the two, saying that 1 out of students could not afford attending when they're attending is not really something I'd like to write home to mother about. I just wanted to put those on the record. The other thing is this public university support fund. When you have to do 10 years, you're basically picking a year. 2013 is not a good year. 2009, 11, I think, if I remember correctly, we cut the public university support fund halfway through, or even maybe earlier than that, through the biennium, and then cut it again. And then it was reduced for 11-13 was perhaps our worst budget biennium in modern times, because we had no federal money was gone, whatever reserves we had were gone. We had used all of the tobacco settlement, and that was gone, and we faced a $3.5 billion deficit. 13-15, which is we're talking about here, because we're 13-14, there may have been a minus. I have to go back and check the numbers, and I think Jim will tell you it's really hard sometimes to check the numbers, because even though governor's budgets are just simply recommended, but the legislative budgets, they end up in, you have to ultimately look for the detailed analysis, and you may sometimes even have to look farther than that to find out what the public university support fund is, because a lot of times it isn't highlighted. But 13-14 is probably a relatively low year. So coming up from what was literally bottoming out after the recession, but I think the bottoming out was probably in 11, 13. We might have been up a little bit in 13, 15. And the other comment I'd like to make is the Oregon Opportunity Grant at 14%. We all know that the increase in the Oregon Opportunity Grant was relatively modest for quite a number of years. And then we had about Jim, was it close to about a 50% increase in one biennium? So saying it's an average of 14% does not really reflect the realities of what it was for much of that decade. I just want to put those on the record. And I think sometimes we tend to make things look more positive than they are. And I think it would be just as bad if we tried to make them worse than they were. But I think the more accuracy we get and the more reasonable level of detail we can get, the better off we are in the commission understanding the impacts and our constituencies understanding the impacts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If Jim wants to comment, I'm ready for any comments.
I do quickly. I appreciate you saying all that. I think you're 100% right. I do want to point out on slide 9, the trend in affordability, that is solely for the public universities by themselves. So, okay. Yeah, but I will say that Amy and her team on our website with the data dashboards for the public universities and the community colleges, you can see both, right, by sector. And then I know Amy last August, when she presented to the commission and talked about affordability and total cost of attendance and delved into some of the components of that, she presented an aggregate across both sectors. And so I think you're rightly recalling that information as well. So,
Mr. Chairman, yeah. If I could ask one more question.
Sure.
Jim, do we expect, I know it's difficult to do this, but in our discussions in coming meetings, as we start to maybe discuss some of these areas, getting more detail about the remissions? I mean, I know we get broad numbers, but it would be interesting to know what the remissions are being used for, which students are receiving them, not by name or anything, but which groups of students are targeted to. I would guess these remission numbers, since they're undergraduates, don't include any of the tuition reductions for graduate assistants or anything like that. But they probably do include specific categories of students. And in some cases, it might be very enlightening just to find out if there's differences between how institutions have approached this. And I did note from some previous reports we've seen that sometimes when institutions are in financial difficulty, obviously their level of remissions actually goes down.
Yeah, that's true. I think we collect currently, as you know, very broad information on remissions. We don't collect a lot of detailed information on remissions, typically because it's, in some cases, proprietary. The universities use remissions as part of their enrollment process to incentivize enrollment for certain types of students, and they have different remission and institutional financial aid programs for different students at different points. So, you know, if you're a Pell eligible resident student, some of the universities waive the rest of your tuition and fees. So there are different, you know, institutional financial aid programs for different students. And frankly, it gets very complicated very quickly, right? Because some students based on need are offered remissions. Some students based on talent are offered remissions. If you're a French horn player and the band happens to be in need of a first chair French horn player, you might get a remission for that. That skill and ability, that's just a very specific example, but remission setting can get very complicated, and I don't want to, you know, tell tales out of school about their strategies, because some of the strategies are intended to enroll specific types of students, underrepresented students, Oregon residents. at different points in time. So, but we collect some information on remissions, but it's not exceedingly detailed. So.
Mr. Chairman, could I make a request? It's somewhat related to this, but
Sure.
either future meeting, and since I have both the chair of the subcommittee here and the chair of the HECC board, it's probably a good opportunity. Maybe not for everyone, but for those of us that would be willing to attend. And I can put together what I'd hope to get from this. For some of us that have not had a student in a public college for quite a while, my daughter is 50 years old. My son is 42. It would be interesting to get a better understanding of current financial aid picture. I know some of you there, and Greg, you haven't been out of the system that long. And some of our student representatives are obviously familiar with their students and their own cases. But I think for some of us, it has been quite a while. I mean, I've tried to help on occasion grandchildren, but knowing what the current situation is, knowing how this all works out, I've sometimes tried to sit down and figure out how a student would attend, if they, I believe not this year, maybe next year, the University of Oregon will go to an average attendance of more than $40,000. And if you're not Pell eligible and you're not Oregon Opportunity Grant eligible, and you're not a star student that's going to pull down a lot of scholarships, but you're just a student that's qualified from an average working family in Oregon, I'm wondering if we've priced them out, literally. And to some degree, I think at the lowest end in terms of economic resources, I'm really, without the remissions, which I know the University of Oregon does fair amount of this, Pell Grant plus Oregon Opportunity Grant, and even what you could borrow as a freshman if you borrowed through public means and not on the outside, which is not necessarily a good idea, you still would fall short. It'd be a good for those of us who would like this primer in a sense. I'm not trying to force anybody into 3 hours of this, but it would be helpful for some of us.
Thank you, Commissioner Devlin. Any other comments or questions? I have a few, but I want to wait for others if you have them. Okay. Jim, I have a couple comments, questions. First, I want to thank Commissioner Devlin for, I think, reminding us of the general inadequacies of averaging statistical data and then some more specific ones as well. I'm wondering, Jim, is it possible, one of the ways in which we address some of the questions that Commissioner Devlin has as we look at aggregate information is something other than a mean average? Are we able to see a median? Are we able to see a spread or modals? Do we have other ways of looking at that data set to help us to understand whether that mean represents a skew or not? And anyway, that's a question. I have a bunch of questions. I'm assuming that the public university financial aid data is limited to undergraduates, since we're only looking at undergraduate information with regards to cost and tuition. So if that's not true, we've got not a matched set of data there. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. Question, one more comment on remissions. As you know, I spent 16 years in private education. We called it discounting, but it's the same principle, and it is something that the privates did predominantly to create, in a sense, income indexed tuition. It was, so I'm kind of a fan of remissions, but I also understand the complexity and the somewhat proprietary, I think you mentioned, proprietary nature of individual institutions doing it. in general, I'm glad to see the public institutions get in that business. I think I think it is a one in which, in general, we increase access, in the absence of overflowing amounts of money. So it's, at least that's, again, how I learned to do it in the privates. And community colleges don't do much of it. They do a little bit, but not much. The universities have really, I think, stepped up in this area. And on slide 6, and then 7, I have a question about the parameters for HECC decision. If it does end up on our lap, is our decision binary, either to approve or disapprove of the tuition, or is there some intermediate decision or process? I seem to remember, perhaps it's not in the rules, but it might be worth talking about. Is there, in the past, I think when we did receive, and it's been a while, a request for tuition above 5%, we actually entered in some kind of process with the institution to arrive at some other tuition level ultimately. And I'm just wondering, that doesn't seem to be built into the model, but how does that fit into sort of the pattern of addressing this issue with individual institutions?
Yeah, I'm going to offer a couple of comments and then tag Ben into the conversation for a better answer. But I believe it's a binary. It has to be a vote up or down. However, and the last time we did this consideration was in 2019, which was also a long session year. And the challenge, of course, when the legislature is in session is that the universities typically have to do their budgeting and they have to make tuition setting decisions before the legislature finalizes funding for the next biennium. So what we've done in the past is we've asked what would happen if, and what is your plan if the state legislature increased the level of funding? Would you then reduce your tuition below? So it has been kind of this yes or no, but with an asterisk to make room and space for varying levels of funding should that occur at the state level. But
yeah, that's exactly right, Jim. It is. I think it's important for the commission to understand that its authority here is binary, and it certainly does not permit the commission to, for example, because this question arose even in the prior to 2019, it does not permit the commission to start to unpack the university budget and say, well, let's change your plans for spending money in the following areas in order to, reduce the need for a tuition increase, right? It clearly does not permit us to go beyond the binary yes, no. But as Jim suggested, in practical terms, a no vote with with instructions to the university to come back with a revised plan, right, that could meet commission approval if it does, the following things, would be one way for the commission to, try to express that it's, to try to get into the weeds a little bit more. And likewise, as Jim noted, this sort of dynamic with the legislature getting a university to commit. So in the 2019 case, yes, supporting the tuition increase, but only with an understanding, an agreement that the university would actually reduce that tuition in the event that the legislature came up with a larger appropriation than the university had at that time been, at the time they did their tuition setting, had been assuming. And that was actually a very productive dynamic, I would say, in 2019, because the legislature did, in the final weeks of the session, appropriate additional funds, and as a result, the tuition for the fall automatically ratcheted down because of the agreement that they had with the commission.
Both of you, I appreciate that response. I think it's important for the commission to have a sort of a more detailed understanding of their role there. Do you have one other question? Do you have any thoughts about how, or perhaps just a better understanding of how the institutions do or estimate the total cost of attendance when they haven't yet approved their tuition?
I don't. I would likely be talking out of school if I answered that without relying on OSAC, because our colleagues in OSAC collect that information, and they may or may not have an answer to that today. To be fair to OSAC, I invited them to this conversation to be prepared to answer questions, but they're busy observing and participating in some legislative hearings this afternoon. So Juan and his team, I don't believe, could make it. But if somebody from OSAC wants to jump in and answer this question, I think there's no, as I understand it, let me say this, there is no standard methodology. Each institution, university and community college, collects and reports total cost of attendance data to us. They use slightly different methodologies to do that because, again, they have to collect average cost for housing and personal expenses. Oftentimes that's done through survey instrumentation. The survey instruments can be slightly different based on campus community. For housing, for example, you might reach out to, a subset of the big housing providers in your community. In smaller areas, rural areas, you might actually poll each and every housing provider. There might not be that many of them. So I think it's slightly different dependent upon the circumstance in the community in which the campus exists. And oftentimes they'll use for like personal expenses, they'll survey current students, existing students, about that information and try to get it as accurate as possible. That's my understanding. So I hope I'm doing justice to that answer, but I would have to rely on OSAC for a better answer.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Jim. Any other questions or comments for Jim on this report, an update on the tuition matter? Yes, Commissioner Devlin.
Mr. Chairman, I just have one comment because I was not in the legislature in 2019, but for the 21 years prior to that, I will tell you that at times there were fairly active negotiations occurring between the universities and the legislature, and potentially, obviously, the chief executive, the governor, over tuition-related issues. And sometimes it led to increases in funding, sometimes it did not, actually. But I mean, it's not an uncommon thing in the year that the legislature is in session. And as you can remember, like prior to, like, we did a couple of experimental short sessions before we actually got voter approval to do them on a regular basis. So now the legislature is meeting literally every year. So I think there is even some of this discussion that occurs in the short session, maybe not as much, but I do think there's a negotiation that occurs there. So I'm just to say it was limited to 1921. So
appreciate that, Commissioner Devlin. Thank you.
Hey, Chair Human, if I may, going back to Commissioner Devlin's, and I think your interest in unpacking the average, right? Understanding it can be wildly divergent from an individual student's experience. Jim included in the comments a link to the federal data, the Department of Education's college scorecard. And what you'll see there is, if you sort of dig through a few layers, the federal data set does report average net price by family income range. And so for every school in the country, and we make good use of this data actually in our Ways and Means presentations and elsewhere to depict affordability in a somewhat more granular way, not just that average, but for students from families with income in the $0 to $30,000 range, here's what their affordability picture looks like versus students in the $75,000 to $110,000 range. So, you're still looking at averages, but it's sliced by income level. I'll just note that when we present this data, typically we highlight the fact that affordability gap, in spite of the concentration of state and federal financial aid on the lowest income students, they still expend the greatest proportion of their family income on college-related costs. So yes, they're getting greater discounts or grant aid, greater amounts of grant aid, but even with that federal and state subsidy, and often university subsidy, they are still expending a greater proportion of their income on college or university than any other income level. And it pretty clearly matches. It's just sort of a stair step on that basis. So in any event, that information is there. We use it, and happy to follow up with that type of reporting.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Commissioner Devlin.
I'd be happy to see some of that reporting as part of some of these discussions. I clearly recognize that even at our current levels, the most in need students still are not having their needs met. I've always been a little bit worried about those students that are kind of in the middle, that don't really qualify for either of those. They may be a qualified student. They may have a 3.5 average in high school, but they're not really getting a lot of money in scholarships. So their family and them are stuck with the full rate. While I have been here, I'd like to make a request. This is part of my understanding of financial aid. I understand now with the Oregon Opportunity Grant that our max grant is going to be somewhere in the $7,000 range. But I don't know, in terms of that $8,000 family contribution, I would assume that $7,000 is those that literally have no family contribution, but how it's reduced as you go into that $8,000. And I do know that I remember that in some categories, we have put minimums on what have been, but it's hard to understand what how that's graduated down.
Yeah, it's an important question, and we'll follow up with the commission on what our award table for the current year. We haven't set it for next year yet, but our opportunity grant award table for the current year, which will show that stair step. You're right, we make the maximum roughly $7,500 opportunity grants to the lowest income students, and then it steps down as their what was expected family contribution, now student aid index, rises. So yeah, we'll happy to follow up with that. And then just staff did note from OSAC that your question, Commissioner Heyman, about setting cost of attendance before tuition is set. Financial aid offices at the institutions use an estimate for the upcoming year that is finalized in the summer after tuition is set. So, there's at some early in the year, we're talking an estimated cost of attendance. Later in the year, after tuition is finalized, they lock that in as the official cost of attendance.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Commissioner Devlin.
This is my last question, and it's actually a request to Ben. I'd like to get some idea too about looking at sort of different family structures about where you get to that $8,000 level, because I think it's probably lower than some people anticipate. And obviously there've been some changes at the federal level, and but it'd be interesting to have a better understanding of that, where you get to that cutoff and where the cutoff is for Pell also.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Commissioner Devlin. I've been asking and wondering similar things, and one of the projects that we have underway in preparation for our Ways and Means testimony is actually to create some illustrative representative student kind of profiles. And so again, not on a statistical basis, but give you a sense of here's what a student, they've got, they're from a family of 5, their parents earn roughly this much, they are in their 3rd year of school, they work, like just give you, and their student aid index is, 12,000 so we're working on that. And I think to, yes, give you a more systematic understanding and the public a more systematic understanding of what is an 8,000 SAI student. It's also, there's a very important distinction between independent and dependent students. These are they're treated very differently for FAFSA purposes, appropriately so, just like for tax purposes. But yes, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there.
Mr. Chairman, I lied. I'd ask to have one final question. And it's not even meant in jest.
Thank you, Commissioner Devlin. Yes.
We haven't received any word of the administration, the federal administration withholding Pell Grants.
No, to our knowledge, Pell Grants have not been affected by even the sort of temporary funding freeze that was briefly in place.
Thank you. Again, any more questions or comments before we move on to the next item?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Jim.
Just very briefly, I feel it appropriate in the interest of full disclosure to correct one data point on docket item 4.0B, the supporting information in the section where we list the undergraduate resident tuition and mandatory fees for all the universities across 10 years in academic year 2017-2018. For University of Oregon, it lists $1,151. That is a typo. That should read that should read $11,571. And so just to correct that in the interest of full disclosure.
Oh, well, we just thought it was radical discounting. So
Students that 1 year got a great deal. Yeah.
Thanks for that correction, Jim. I believe we're done with this topic then, and we will move on to the next item, which is an action item again. This is a permanent rule amendment relating to the community college funding for applied baccalaureate programs. Jim.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is related to a change in state law. So during the 2024 regular legislative session, Senate Bill 1552 passed, which included a provision that made applied baccalaureate programs and bachelor's of science in nursing programs specifically eligible for funding through the CCSF. Previously, those programs had not been eligible for funding. And so this rule does nothing more than update our administrative rules to make those degree programs eligible for funding for the first time ever. So that's essentially what the amendments do, but I'll point your attention to pages 3 and 4 of docket item 5.0, where we attempt to tease out the estimated impact of this. And I think that's the important part here. Again, it's state law. We're obligated to make this change. But we note in Table A that right now there are 3 applied baccalaureate programs, one at Chemeketa Community College, one at Mount Hood, and one at Lane. This fall in 2025, coming up, we'll have a BSN, a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing, that starts at Lane. And then there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more starting with the fall of 2026. So the maximum enrollment across all of those programs would be 237 students. And so if we looked at that and assumed a 1-for-1 relationship between the number of students enrolled and the number of fundable FTEs in the formula at the current level of funding per FTE of $6,276 per student, which is only state funding, not total public resources, mind you, then we're looking at a potential impact of about $1.5 million moving around, shifting around amongst the 17 colleges. To put it in scale, that's roughly 0.4 percentage point of the total CCSF right now currently. But next fall, when we implement these rule changes, assuming that the action you take today and tomorrow as a full commission adopts these amendments, then we estimate for fiscal year 2026, once we start this process, we're going to see Chemeketa and Mount Hood almost immediately get additional funding, about $220,000, give or take. And that'll, again, reallocate that 220,000 amongst the 17 colleges. So that's my best understanding based on our attempts to analyze this and forecast what this will actually do to reallocate the funding amongst the 17 colleges. So I'll pause there for questions that you have. We did have a public hearing on January 17th. We did not receive testimony or written comments. We did share these amendments with the colleges themselves and other partners as appropriate prior to the public hearing. We did work with these amendments with our partners in CCWD internally here at the HECC, and we appreciate Guthrie and Kyle for their assistance in helping us file these with the Secretary of State. But I'll pause there for questions and forward to answering any questions.
Any questions for Jim on this matter? No. Jim, thank you for clarifying that. It was helpful to see. I appreciated seeing the estimated financial impact on the Community College Support Fund. It's also appreciate seeing it referenced back to legislation, Senate Bill 1552, I believe, that our role here is simply to modify administrative rule to accommodate that change in state law. And so that context certainly helped me to understand this, and I appreciate that. So thank you. This is a action item. We would be moving to approve it for forward to the full commission with our recommendation that it be approved.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Devlin.
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Simnett. All in favor? Motion, hand, something. I believe we have made that motion, approved that motion. Thanks, all of you. Any additional comments, delay tactics, and otherwise before we adjourn this meeting? None whatsoever. So again, I thank all of you, and we will see you tomorrow. Anything you want to say, Commissioner Chair Rowe, with regards to tomorrow's meeting? Nope. Okay, thank you. Then we are adjourned.